Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I'm joined again by Master Sanders. This is a follow-up episode to yesterday's episode, which was prematurely cut short due to internet connection issues with Master Sanders. Given the importance of the topic and things that were left unsaid, we thought it was a good idea to continue on with a follow-up episode. So, Master Sanders, why don't we try to pick up where you left off?
I think if I remember correctly, we were talking about total war and some of the issues relating to that. Going back to Sherman, oftentimes you'll see, as I think I mentioned last time, the left fetishize Sherman. And to a degree, many people, of course, in the North held up Sherman as a hero, obviously because of his role in the ending of the Civil War. Now, the problem is that Sherman always resented this. Well, maybe not resented his role, but he resented a lot of the adulation he got, because often it took on a triumphalist tone. It took on this idea that, a joy over the destruction of a fallen enemy. Whenever he would go to different places throughout the rest of his life, of course, local bands would greet him with marching through Georgia. Now, he hated it for about two reasons. One of them was because, again, they played it every time he saw him, and so it was annoying, but also because he didn't particularly like the triumphalist spirit of it. And it truly is that level of Yankee triumphalism that arguably created more resentment toward the North in the years following the Civil War. Now, often Sherman is upheld by hero on that side simply because of his wanton destructiveness. Unlike people like McClellan, he seemed to be somebody who was actually willing to fight and take this to its logical conclusion and end the war. In reality, Sherman was not as war hungry or as warmongering as some of his supporters might have thought him to be. You kind of see that as a trend with a lot of great generals, that like a lot of great generals and soldiers don't have the same level of worship for war in the same way that people that never have fought it. Shortly after the surrender of the Confederacy, he actually wrote this in a personal letter. He writes, I confess without shame that I am sick and tired of fighting. Its glory is all moonshine. Even success, the most brilliant, is over dead and mangled bodies, with the anguish and lamentations of distant families appealing to me for sons, husbands, and fathers. 'Tis only those who have never heard a shot, never heard the shrieking groans of the wounded and lacerated, that cry aloud for more blood, more vengeance, more desolation. So, if anything, he saw his duty in the war. Well, he saw his actions in the war as more of a duty, just to get the war over with. He never took glory in the fact that he caused such wanton destruction in the South. But even he, with some of the dangerous precedents he set, at least acknowledged that war in and of itself is something to be avoided. At least it's not something to be glorified. And unfortunately, many of his adherents, both on the right and the left, have ignored that. And today the Civil War has been used as an example of a good war, right? So a good war, which, if there is a such thing as a good war, it follows that other conflicts for similar moral reasons could also be executed with just as much wantonness and destruction, and which, as I think we mentioned last time, quite a few generals in different regions of the world took Sherman's example and utilized it to great effect, like the Spanish and the British, and of course World Wars I and II. So I think the lesson is, again, people like Lee and Sherman, people who actually had to fight these wars and execute these wars, never looked on it with some level of glory or that it was something that is a viable option. If anything, they probably would have understood war to be a final option.
Exactly. And the other thing that needs to be held in mind with this total war mentality, and more broadly the issue of constitutional conservatives and conservatism in general. Why does the conservative movement defend Lincoln, the Civil War, and all of this, when purportedly they claim to be, strict constitutional interpretations? One of the problems is literally everything the federal government does, it violates the 10th Amendment. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now, there's an interpretation that's developed along the Hamiltonian tradition whereby anything not prohibited to the federal government is allowed to it. But that's just transparently absurd. None of the states would have signed the Constitution in 1787 if they thought that it meant that if they thought that they were going to give up all of their liberties to the federal government. And in fact, the Anti-Federalists had a robust, I would argue, like to correct criticism of the federal government as they conceived it growing and becoming tyrannical. And the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments, were a concession to them to get them to support the Constitution. And yet even strict, constitutional interpretations, quote unquote, by conservatives accept, legal precedent on a whole host of issues that the federal government has no right having a say in, since the Constitution has not been amended such that it gives the federal government this authority. And we also look at the attitude towards war itself by the Founding Fathers. Ben Franklin said there was no such thing as a good war or a bad peace. You would be hard put to find anyone who would say that today amongst conservative constitutional elements of society. And we see that this purported defense of the Constitution by conservatives, coupled with their historical hagiography of Lincoln and the Civil War, really creates this conundrum where it's like these are literally cross purposes. McPherson was right in that Lincoln was a new birth of America. It was a repudiation of the old America, the John Quincy Adams who said we do not go abroad seeking for monsters to destroy, like maybe slavery. But that's not even that far abroad. And we've sort of switched to go out on this crusading attitude. And they are fundamentally different, fundamentally incompatible. And the federal powers that were amassed by this are incompatible with the 10th Amendment.
Well, I think if we were to go in a time machine and we were to ask anybody like Washington or Franklin or Adams, and if we were to, many of whom were either outright opposed to slavery or understood that slavery was on its way out, if we were to ask them, do you think the states have a right to, what individual states have the right to secede from the United States if the federal government was perceived as growing too large in power? I think everyone would probably say yes, because they employed similar arguments in their reasoning for declaring their independence from the United Kingdom, which was that the Parliament, and by extension the King, had crossed many lines that had been set up by precedents throughout English and history. And that in and of itself, such as things, taxation, no taxation without representation, the rights of Englishmen when it comes to trial, the quartering of soldiers, and even to a lesser extent, the right to bear arms, which Gage, when he was military governor of Massachusetts, attempted to seize, of course, several stockpiles of weapons, which arguably touched off the war. But nevertheless, you see the founding fathers would have understood secession or the arguments of the secessionists, even if they were not enthusiastic about slavery in and of itself, because of their desire to keep tyranny at bay, which was the whole purpose of a constitution to begin with, and that was actually part of the arguments that the Federalists made, people like Hamilton and Madison, which was that the Constitution itself would not grow tyrannical. Now, it turns out, unfortunately, interpretations and additions have allowed that to happen. But nevertheless, I don't think that the founders would have opposed Southern efforts of secession, at least based on the arguments that Southerners were making. This whole idea that the United States was anything but a compact of states was not settled until after the Civil War, when the Confederacy was defeated. And it does really bother me, as you mentioned, that a lot of supposedly constitutional conservatives will fetishize Lincoln, when in reality, Lincoln trampled on the Constitution as president. By the way, a lot of the criticisms that were leveled at Lyndon Johnson for botching up Vietnam with civilian interference in tactics against the North Vietnamese and things such as Operation Rolling Thunder, well, Lincoln did basically the same thing in a lot of these ways. In fact, the constant rotation of generals because they wouldn't do what he wanted them to do was a large part of that. in which it's amazing that there was any victory to be secured at all in the East, in large part because of Lincoln's meddling, which he did not demonstrate in the Western campaign, which was remarkably successful for the Union. So I think as a lot of conservatives, no matter where you fall on the spectrum, it makes no sense to exalt Lincoln in the way they do. And I think that the tendency by a lot of conservatives to not only fetishize Lincoln, but to throw the South under the bus with things such as like, well, Democrats are the real racists, just for cheap political partisan points, is incredibly disingenuous and has, I think, in many sense, proven that these people are not really conservatives in any sense of the word.
Well, exactly. And not to get too deep into the quote, but Robert Louis Dabney had a thoughtful comment on conservatives and how they can serve nothing. But he writes, American conservatism is merely the shadow that follows radicalism as it moves forward to perditions. It remains behind it but never retards it, and always advances nearer its leader. Its impotency is not hard indeed to explain. It is worthless because it is the conservatism of expediency only, and not of sturdy principle. And I really think that that's partly why these conservatives keep on getting led along by the nose, and they keep changing their position because at the time in the 1850s and 60s, the Democratic Party were the conservatives, Copperheads, the planter class. They would have been what we might call, quote unquote, the conservatives, and the radicals and the quote unquote the liberals were the Republicans, with the transcendentalists and the abolitionists and groups like that. And I feel like that again, they just are. Dabney was right, in other words.
Well, he's right. And somebody on the other end, because Dabney was very much a Reformed Protestant theologian, on the other end, I believe Thomas Fleming, who's a traditional Catholic, has said something similar about conservatism, in that conservatives today treat a lot of liberal principles, and their relationship with liberalism is the same way of a hostage to his captor, which when they get to the point where they're actively defending their captor. Yeah, not to get too far off on that, but still. And I think another thing that we often miss is that was the Civil War. Okay, when we talk about the Civil War being necessary to fight, what did it have to happen at all? It goes more than just simply the moral principle of it. It's just like, even if we accept that chattel slavery is an incredible evil that needs to be ended, did it require 630,000 men to do so? And oftentimes, again, this is what you'll hear from conservatives, is when they're trying to defend against liberal attacks on the existence of the United States in general. Conservatives will often say, like, well, I don't think any other country on earth has, spent thousands of lives to free slaves. Well, I mean, yeah, that's true, but was it necessary? I mean, the British Empire had abolished slavery decades earlier with a far more peaceful method through manumission. And while Brazil's was rather abrupt, following the collapse of the monarchy, they still did it without a civil war, and that was about 20 years later. So with examples such as the British Empire and Brazil on the front end and on the back end, I think the question becomes, was a war necessary at all to free slaves, especially one as costly as the American Civil War? Now, this is not to say that one side or the other is to blame solely for what happened. Arguably, that you had the fire eaters on the south and the rabid abolitionists in the north made more moderate voices drowned out, and it made it difficult to have a compromise where potentially slavery could eventually be ended. But the radicals on both sides made it very difficult for that to happen. It's rather interesting that leadership on both sides, both in civilian and in military, were made up of largely moderates. People like Lee and Jackson and Davis and Stevens were not rabid abolitionists. They tended to lean toward unionism. In fact, I think Stevens was a delegate to the Georgia Convention, and I think he was a supporter of, he was an opponent of secession. And then in the North, people like McClellan and even Sherman were not enthusiastic abolitionists. For them, this was not a pure political exercise. And even Lincoln was considered a moderate in his party starting out with when it came to slavery. So I do find it interesting is that the war was led by moderates on both sides, being driven by the radicals on the other. and that's what made a potential peaceful solution to the war problematic. And arguably, political considerations was what kept the war from being concluded earlier and on far more favorable terms, which including the pressure on Republicans to deliver a blow against Lee in the Eastern campaign, and others. And so there's a lot of blame to go around. I'm saying that's what I'm saying. There's a lot of blame to go around, but I don't necessarily think that, given the precedence of the British Empire and Brazil, among others, that slavery in the United States absolutely had to be ended through blood.
Well, there was also the abolition of serfdom in Russia in 1861, the year the Civil War started. But the other element, and then this is an element that developed shortly during the latter period of the war and continues to the present day, that the war was about the abolition of slavery. Now, we've mentioned how the left in general has a hypocritical relationship to, on the one hand, its criticism of the U.S. empire and the U.S. tactics and strategies that it uses throughout the world, but apparently not when it's used for a good cause like ending slavery. That's not to say there weren't some who were consistent. So, for example, while one might criticize William Lloyd Garrison as a hypocrite who professed to be a pacifist until Lincoln went to war to end slavery, we do have the witness of Lysander Spooner, a abolitionist anarchist. And Lysander Spooner writes, "The pretense of the abolition of slavery was either a motive or a justification for the war is a fraud of the same character with that of maintaining the national honor. Who but such usurpers, robbers, and murderers as they ever established slavery, or what government except resting upon the sword like the one we now have was ever capable of maintaining slavery? And why did these men abolish slavery, not only from any love of liberty in general, not as an act of justice to the black man himself, but only as a war measure, and because they wanted his assistance and that of his friends in carrying on the war they had undertaken for maintaining and intensifying that political, commercial, and industrial slavery to which they have subjected the great body of the people, both black and white. And yet these impostors now cry out that they have abolished the chattel slavery of the black man, although that was not the motive of the war, as they thought they could thereby conceal, atone for, or justify that other slavery which they were fighting to perpetuate, and to render more rigorous and inexorable than ever was before. There was no difference of principle, but only of degree, between the slavery they boast they have abolished and the slavery they were fighting to preserve. For all restraints upon man's liberty, not necessary for the simple measure of justice, are those of the nature of slavery, and differ from each other only in degree." And so, while Spooner condemned chattel slavery in the South, he also did not jump on the Lincoln bandwagon, seeing the great danger that the Lincoln government posed to the future of liberty in the United States and to the world in general. And arguably, you don't find that many principled people who see the nuance of the struggle and the difficulty entailed and make that distinction. And as then, as now, there are very few Lysander Spooners that are able to make such a distinction. And again, it goes back to the fact that the left is always saying that the capitalist system is a form of slavery as it currently exists. Well, as we said in the last episode, this is how the capitalist system got established. The rapid growth of U.S. economic industrial interests occurred after 1865. And it happened because of the predominance of the Republican Party and because of the predominance that they exerted politically by their direct efforts in the war itself.
Well, exactly. And another example, probably one of the more honest or at least consistent leftists on this regard, might actually be Eugene Genovese. Now, Genovese was initially a Marxist historian that had made tremendous strides in scholarship regarding the culture of slaves and the culture of slaveholders. Of course, he did this through the prism of Marxist history, but nevertheless, his work is actually quite good in establishing that the worldviews of slaves and slaveholders was not created as to justify a system. In other words, it wasn't a post hoc justification for what they were currently living in. In other words, Genovese was saying that slaveholders actually believed the worldview that they espoused, that slavery was part of the great chain of being, and their worldview was in many ways a reflection of medieval ideas regarding societal structure and the cosmology. But going back to this idea of this lack of consistency on the left, you're right. This has The problem is that many of the problems decried by both the right and the left were created under the conditions of the Civil War, thanks to the not just the fact that troops were used, but the fact that uh, government grew exponentially through an attempt to quell dissent at home. People said, Maryland, of course, is a more infamous example. And of course, then you had that one senator from Ohio who was arrested for speaking out against the war effort. And of course, during the war, the term copperhead in and of itself was meant to imply some level of treachery on behalf of opponents to the war, which that eventually included people like Franklin Pierce, who was, despite being from New England, was very much Southern in a lot of his sympathies, and so even he was accused of being somewhat in on an evil, subversive plot to thwart the war and for the triumph of slavery. And so it shows you that we are in many ways slaves to the zeitgeist, people on both the right and the left. That somehow the Civil War was justified in that regard, and then as a result, it's very difficult to actually bring up these issues without being accused of being a lost causer. Oh, and one more thing about Genovese. Genovese, went from being a Marxist to being a traditionalist Catholic. And Genovese he said his draw to traditionalist conservatism was that he could still bash capitalism, right? As a conservative. And even he found that the Southern system of familial ties to the land and other things were in direct contrast to the more capitalist values of Northern industrialism. I tend to think he perhaps exaggerates some of these distinctions, but nevertheless, he's somewhat consistent, at least on this issue, both when he was left wing and then when he was right wing, in a way that you don't see that level of consistency among people on both sides today.
Yes, yes. And the other element then is also, why is it that both this vast bipartisan support for Lincoln and the U.S. Civil War? So it goes, it goes without saying that something like PBS, when they do a documentary about the Civil War, obviously going to take an uncritical and hagiographic view of Abraham Lincoln and his presidency. But you also see, like, Prager, you had a video a few years back where a U.S. Army colonel, said he's proud to be a part of the army that despoiled the South and freed the slaves. And part of it is both of these groups, the conservatives and Republicans, and then the new Democrats, if you will, are both creatures of the post-war, and in this sense, I mean the post-Civil War consensus. It's almost like an event horizon, and they're on the other side. Anything before that just doesn't exist anymore, or is irrelevant, and it creates the new terms of engagement that everybody has to operate in. And so I think in part that's why there's this vast bipartisan support for it. I think also the elements in the United States that were already hawkish before the Civil War, the South and the West, are always spoiling for a good fight anyhow. And so many Westerners would be fine with this sort of military crusading fervor that the Civil War generates. And many in the South were good losers, and they took advantage of other U.S. wars in the future to get their Celtic piss and vinegar out. And then the New Englanders and the Midwesterners, who had more of an anti-war tradition, were then seduced by the idea of moral crusade, making the world safe for this or that moral goal. And so there's these sectional and cultural affinities to aspects of the narrative that are played upon by the political interests to consolidate people for supporting future U.S. actions.
Well, I mean, and for the right, obviously, it's for foreign interventionism and a more active U.S. foreign policy. But on the left, of course, it's for handing out um, basically government goodies to select constituency groups. all in the name of reparations for a horrendous institution that nobody in the present has ever had to suffer. So both sides have utilized this to their own end, and in a way that you typically don't see events like this in the present. So we in many ways, that you're right, we can't really have a discussion out of the morality of the Civil War without raising some level of emotion today, or it's almost people you try to talk to about that, they're almost dismissive, and or it's like you suggested, like, what if the sky is actually red, or what if the sky is actually green? It's almost foreign to our discourse, because we've breathed this air for so long, and that makes it really difficult to assess. You now, following the Iraq War, you did see quite a few intellectuals on both the right and the left revisit certain things, like Pat Buchanan uh, did his book on Churchill and the Unnecessary War, and then you also had people like Harry Stout about the same time questioning the overall moral rectitude of the Civil War. But we're going past that now. Both sides have now kind of returned back to, war in and of itself is an inherent good and is part of America's greatness. So it's going to be a while before we reach that point. I'm afraid that we can actually have a decent conversation on the long-term negative effects of the Civil War.
Well, I think also part of it too is that it's become increasingly politicized, and whenever you politicize anything, it becomes very difficult to talk about it in a dispassionate, accurate fashion. I mean, when we look at the concerns of the Copperheads about the advance of federal power due to conscription, if we look at Lee's concern about the imperial and authoritarian U.S. government, all of that came true in spades. If we look at Spooner's criticism of the banksters or the corporate elites that were behind the war, as he sees it, he was absolutely right as well. And all of these things can be seen to be true, but no one is allowed to say that they're true. And furthermore, there seems to be this bizarre malfunction where because chattel slavery is held up as one of the worst evils ever, it has to be eliminated no matter the cost, but only selectively, right? Chattel slavery existed in the Islamic world and still does today, and yet nobody's advocating a crusade to bring fire and sword to the Islamic world to end slavery. It might, in fact, be because most of the chattel slavery in the Islamic world affects Christians disproportionately. That might be part of it. And furthermore, when the British Empire in Africa did use the abolition of slavery as an excuse for its conquest of Africa, most of the left just blows it off and says it was a thin veneer for imperialist aggression. Well, okay, how is Lincoln any different? How is that any different than the British in Rhodesia, the British in East Africa? Well, it's not, but there's reasons, right?
Exactly, and it shows you like how vacuous this is, and it really is, as you said, because of reasons. And going back to why don't we engage in slavery today? Well, not only is chattel slavery, prominent in the Middle East. In fact, in places like I don't want to hear Al Jazeera lecture the United States on its history of slavery when not only chattel slavery but black African slavery is still prominent in places like Qatar and others. So I don't want to hear that. But you're right. It's not only that it's prevalent in the Middle East and prevalent in other parts of the world. It's prevalent in the United States. Maybe not the same way, but it's effectively still in effect. So places like Atlanta are just absolute centers of the slave trade in sex trafficking. The problem is, though, I think it's because if we were to truly shine a light on it and to demonstrate like how prevalent and all-encompassing it is, it would probably take out a lot of prominent politicians and business leaders and others that are actively involved in it or have some connection to it. So it's easy to kind of dump on the past for that reason, for something that's going on, and arguably that's far worse than anything that happened in the antebellum South.
Yeah, and one of the things too that we see is that by politicizing it, as with all sorts of political politicizations of events, right? There is no because chattel slavery and other things have just only and even only certain kinds of chattel slavery for reasons have been defined as the worst thing ever. Any measure to fight it or to atone for it is justified. So it's a way for race pimps to generate support and influence in order to say that there's never any amount of money that you could pay us to satisfy us. But they also don't really have any serious intention of doing such a drastic thing, because then they would, if they actually solved that particular problem, then they wouldn't have a constituency anymore. It's for home consumption, right? And they use it to keep on getting reelected into a mass political power for themselves, not necessarily to solve any evil itself. But the other perversity of it too is that this kind of ethical thinking is essentially pagan and atheist, because if we look at the teachings of ethics in the Torah and the New Testament, the father is not to be put to death for the sins of the son, or the sons for the sins of the father. Each man is to be put to death for his own sins. And so there's no such thing as collective guilt. That's the great moral contribution of the Jewish people to the world, is that there is no such thing as collective guilt. And it's a complete regression back to savagery, barbarism, and atheism to believe that there is such a thing.
Well, exactly. And so it's something like this has been exploited to no end for rather dubious measures, and has been responsible in large part for the violence that you see today. Which I do really get tired of the analogies between American chattel slavery of the 19th century and the Holocaust of the 20th century. I mean, think of like the worst atrocities committed in human history, whether by Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union or communist China. I mean, and American chattel slavery pales in comparison to that. This idea that, the master could just go out and shoot any of his slaves if he just felt like it, that just didn't happen unless he was incredibly crazy or stupid, which again, even at its worst aspects, as what libertarians are very fond of reminding us, there was some level of enlightened self-interest that forced you to at least care for your slaves on a minimal level in a way that not even most factories wanted to do at the time. So, in this, this playing on, as you're right, race pimps, race hustlers, people that play on these painful events, have been given currency by our exaltation of the Civil War. So, and also going back to conservatives, and when they try to insist that, like, well, no other country has spent so much. I think that conservatives just need to realize is that people that try to invoke the history of slavery in the United States are not interested in coming to an actual moral terms with it. The reality is that they're doing that, of course, as you said, for power and for money. And conservatives do a disservice to the discussion at all by taking these people seriously, by saying things like, again, no other country on earth has spent so much blood for the ending of slavery, especially since, as we talked about yesterday, the result may not have been that good for all parties involved.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the other thing too is it's easy to attack people that are long dead, that have no chance of defending themselves or setting the record straight, or firebombing your house. So it's really easy to go after people in the past. And we see this across the board with Black nationalists, with the race hustlers, with Southern nationalists today, and with Merca First nationalists. Is a lot of the animosities of people today that never actually experienced the horrors of the war are much higher than the actual people that suffered through it. Soldiers, North and South, at the end of the war, just wanted to get back to normal as quickly as possible. They sort of patched up their relationships and just acted like they could not like nothing happened per se, but like what happened was an unfortunate tragedy that should be forgotten and moved beyond as quickly as possible. I've already mentioned uh, Sherman's return to Atlanta, and the accounts that we get from the slave narratives in the 1930s from the surviving slaves who remembered the old days before the Civil War, they had fond reminiscences of it. Now, as you know, Thaddeus Russell says, we might criticize whether they thought they should have thought that way or not, but that's what they said they felt. They had positive feelings about their masters. They reminisced about the days of slavery, saying it was actually easier than working in a modern corporatist structure, which actually would sort of support the argument that the Southerners made that yeah, their system was more humane than Yankee mercantile capitalism. But again, the slave narratives almost never show up anymore, or at least in a highly selected, edited form. Um, and so it almost seems as an inverse square principle where the further away you are from an event and the less the event really matters, the more fired up and emotional people get about it.
That's sad but true. And going back to this idea, like the war was not prosecuted by people that had fierce animosities either way. During Gettysburg, there were remarkable measures of chivalry and mercy showed on both sides. Those that were captured on both sides were able to receive medical attention from their medics. So if you were a Yankee officer captured by the South, you would be treated by Southern medics and vice versa. One story I remember reading about that stuck out to me, I think it was on the second day. There was a Yankee orderly that went out in the midst of a firefight and was trying to pull off the field the bodies of wounded Confederates that had fallen just minutes before. And after going back several times, he finally was hit by a Confederate volley himself. I mean, like, who does that? Like, who does that? And the thing is, the war was fought by people, again, on both sides. They didn't have a tremendous amount of animosity toward the other. South just wanted to be left alone, and the North, just those that were interested in fighting, were more interested in preserving the Union as they understood it. And you're right. After the war, you had reunions of men on both sides that came together at battlefields and celebrated it. The fact that the war was over and the fact that reconciliation had come. I believe it was on the 50th anniversary of Gettysburg. You had a number of Confederate veterans that walked the field where Pickett's charge took place. And once they reached the other side where the wall was and the Yankee position was, they were greeted with handshakes by the same veterans who were standing on that side of the wall. I mean, who does that? Like, what war does that happen? Especially when it comes to something as visceral as civil war happens. I don't think, put it this way, I don't think after the Spanish Civil War that there were monarchists and anarchists that came together and reminisced about how they
No,
no.
no. Well, there's also another example of this happening where at the Battle of Kennesaw Ridge, James McPherson was killed, and both Union and Confederate generals, called for a truce. And in fact, a Confederate general took his hat off and mourned the passing of McPherson. They'd actually been friends at West Point.
Well, exactly, and similar on that point, when Sherman died, one of his pallbearers was Joe Johnston. His enemy in much of the Western campaign. And at the time of the wedding, of the funeral, it was raining very heavily, and Johnston refused to wear his hat. Now, he was asked, if that was safe for him to do, particularly at somebody at his age and in that weather. He said, well, I know Sherman would have done the same for me. And consequently, he did catch a cold and he did die, shortly thereafter. But again, there was a tremendous amount of chivalry and goodwill and mercy shown on both sides of the war, which, again, that doesn't happen in most civil wars. That doesn't happen even in most modern wars today. I don't even, which that shows you, again, that the people who actually fought this war did not really fight it with the same level of vehemence that their descendants do today, who suffered nothing from it, not at least directly. And I'm sure that if we were to, if Sherman and Johnston and Lee and Grant were to all see what was happening today, I think they'd be horrified how their partisans on both sides have just use this as a way to create further division between the North and the South.
Yeah, exactly. And as we've said in earlier parts, that the complicated issue that was slavery in the South, well, has in fact never actually been resolved. And the idea that it has been resolved is a lie. Whatever you think about the arguments made by BLM and the left, obviously a large segment of the American population doesn't think that this issue was ever resolved. And so then if this whole war was fought to resolve the issue and 160 years later it isn't resolved, then it blatantly failed in the purpose that these people claim it was fought for.
Exactly, which is why, again, I don't think conservatives should try to play that game, because for certain people who have a vested interest in stoking racial tensions for their own benefit, they're not going to let you say that it's solved. They're not going to do it unless they get what they want, and even then they'll find something else. If I guarantee you, if the plan to redistribute land in the South based on 40 acres and a mule were to actually have happened, I guarantee you that there probably would be some today that would say, well, it should have been 100 acres, a mule, and a cow, right? There's nothing you can do. Like the problem is that we have allowed our moral apprehensions around the issue of chattel slavery and the Civil War to allow for our opponents to dictate the terms of actual discussion. And again, that's probably the greatest tragedy of the Civil War, is that it's provided an issue for agitators across the spectrum to use as a bludgeon against their enemies, whether it's leftists talking about how slavery never really ended or it was never really settled, or rightists that use the Civil War to justify conflict in foreign parts of the world. So I guess that probably is the greatest tragedy of the Civil War.
Yeah, the sort of if you want to call it the true history or the real history, if it was written a very long time ago, probably in the decade or so after the war, but it would seem that it hasn't been written yet.
Yeah. I would say, well, I would used to say with confidence is that maybe we need we need to have people that have died, or people who have never had any living memory of the Civil War or of any event or person in human history to write anything objective about that event or that person. We may have to have a couple more generations before we have an honest assessment as to what caused the Civil War, why it was fought at all, and was it actually worth it.
Exactly. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Because I think we've pretty much covered all the topics.
I think when it comes to history, it's always good to have a healthy skepticism of the narrative. It's not to say that every narrative is false, but in order to strengthen that narrative, it always needs challenging. Because once you challenge it, you can verify how true it is, how well it stands up in the face of facts. You can tell that something is very weak when when its proponents of the narrative refuse to even debate, when they refuse to even entertain such questions. The problem with the Civil War is, I think, for partisans on both sides, is that if we were to actually take an honest look at the Civil War, and if it should have been fought at all, or were the effects really worth it in the aftermath, the fact that it's so vehemently defended while attempting to shut down all debate in some quarters, or just simply mock or dismiss those that do bring up these issues, I think shows you like how weak it is. So if we're going to hopefully avoid much more sectional, racial, and other forms of division, while simultaneously keeping many more of our future doctors and doctors and leaders and pastors and other great men and women from being killed or prematurely killed through things such as pointless wars that only create further chaos later. I think a reassessment of the Civil War, especially from a position of morality, is long overdue.
All right. Thank you, Master Sanders. This is Todd Lewis of the President Folly Podcast, signing off.